this section, I cover all the basic footwork that is required for both attacking and defending against attacks. The majority of the movements are not overly complex. The difficult part is not breaking your stance as you execute them. More specifically, you don't want to drop your hands, spread your feet too far apart, or do anything that will compromise your stance. To begin, start with the simple steps, such as side steps, forward and backward steps, and switching your stance. Once you get the hang of them, move on to pivot steps. The goal in this section is to get an introduction to the movements that you'll be using later in the DVD to set up attacks and counterattacks. Instead of rushing through this section, take your time with it. Work on developing each technique, and then work on putting them together. Learning the side step may take just a few seconds, but it gets a little more complex when you combine it with a pivot. There are an infinite number of footwork combinations that you can put together, and the more you master, the more dangerous you become. While your stance is your foundation, your footwork is your ground floor. In this sequence, I demonstrate basic footwork. I show the side step, forward step, and back step movements, all of which can be utilized to initiate an attack or evade one of your opponent's attacks. They can also be combined with more complex movements, such as the shuffle step or pivot step. As a rule of thumb, always lead with the foot closest to the direction you want to head. If you have your left foot in front and want to step forward, move your left foot first. If you want to step to your right, step your right foot first. And if you want to move to your left, step your left foot first. Unless you're setting up a specific technique, never cross your feet. If you do, your balance will be compromised and your body will be open to attack. It is also important to maintain a tight stance as you move about. Keep your hands up at chin level and your elbows tucked to your sides. This will put you in a prime position to either attack or defend on a moment's notice. Lastly, never let your feet get too spread apart. To maintain a balanced stance, take small steps and immediately drag your trailing leg forward. Again, this will ensure that you are always ready to attack or defend. In this sequence, I demonstrate a shuffle step, which is a good technique to employ to cover a lot of distance in a hurry without breaking your stance. The forward shuffle step is generally used to set up an attack, and the backward shuffle step is generally used to evade one of your opponent's attacks. Just as with general movement, you always want to lead with the foot closest to the direction you want to head. It is also important to maintain your stance throughout the movement. You want to keep your feet roughly a shoulder width apart. If they come too close together or spread too far apart, your balance will be compromised, which gives your opponent an opportunity to attack. Avoid picking your feet up off the mat as you shuffle. Instead, slide them across the mat. This will prevent your opponent from launching an attack while you are in the air, as well as quickly put you in a position to attack or defend. To execute a forward switch step, all you have to do is step your rear foot forward. If you're in a standard fighting stance, step your right foot in front of your left. If you're in a southpaw stance, step your left foot in front of your right. Although it is an extremely simple technique, it can prove invaluable when hunting down a retreating opponent or while in the middle of a striking combination. By switching your stance, you create different angles of attack and force your opponent to adjust to your new positioning. The backward switch step is the same as the forward switch step in that you reverse the positioning of your feet to assume an opposite fighting stance, but instead of stepping your rear forward movement. Just as with the shuffle step, do not elevate your feet off the mat. Instead, slide them across the mat into their new position. It is also important to keep your feet positioned roughly a shoulder width apart to maintain a solid base. The sidestep to inside pivot can prove useful in several scenarios. For example, if you're in a southpaw stance and your opponent circles towards the outside of your lead foot, executing a sidestep can keep your hips aligned with his and prevent him from obtaining a dominant angle of attack. If he changes directions and begins circling towards the inside of your lead leg, executing an inside pivot again allows you to keep your hips square with his hips. By utilizing this simple technique, you can keep your opponent in front of you with minimal movement. The sidestep to inside pivot can also be used as an attack. For example, you may advance on your opponent's center line with a series of strikes and then execute a sidestep to inside pivot to acquire a more dominant angle of attack. As with all the footwork techniques shown in this section, I recommend practicing the movements while shadowboxing and sparring as much as possible. To perform the inside pivot, I take a small outward step with my lead foot, shift my weight onto my lead leg, and then slide my rear foot circularly along the mat. A common mistake a lot of fighters make is they slide their foot first and then rotate their upper body, which compromises their balance. Instead, you want to move your entire body as a single unit. The outside pivot is similar to the inside pivot, but instead of acquiring a dominant angle on your opponent's right side, you acquire a dominant angle on his left side. As you will learn later in the DVD, there are many situations in which this technique proves useful. For example, if your opponent is circling towards your left side, executing an outside pivot allows you to square your hips with his hips, eliminating his dominant angle of attack. The primary difference between the inside pivot and the outside pivot is the direction in which you rotate. With my left foot forward, I slide my rear leg in a clockwise direction to execute an inside pivot, and slide it in a counterclockwise direction to execute an outside pivot. In this section, I teach all the punching techniques that I use in mixed martial arts. No matter which punch you throw, you want to keep your striking arm relaxed and generate power using your legs, hips, and the rotation of your shoulders. If you have any tension in your arm, you will not only lose power and speed, but you'll also burn precious energy. It is also very important to immediately bring your striking arm back into your stance after landing a punch. A lot of fighters have the bad habit of dropping their arm as they bring it back toward their body, but if you're up against a good counterpuncher, this is an excellent way to get knocked out. To avoid breaking your hand, which is quite common in MMA due to the small gloves worn by the fighters, you always want to strike your target using only the knuckles of your index and middle fingers. To protect your face from counterstrikes, always keep your free arm elevated. When studying the moves, pay special attention to how each one is best utilized. Some punches are more applicable as a lead-in attack, some work better as a secondary attack, and some are most effective as a counter-attack. Later in the DVD, I will demonstrate how to string various punches together to form combinations, as well as show you how to use the various punches to counter your opponent's attacks. But in the beginning, it is